In April 2025, the total federal debt of the United States of America accumulated to $37.3 trillion, which is approximately 35% of the global GDP. With a population of 350 million, each American citizen owes more than $100,000 on average. The national debt has ballooned to such an extent because the US government has been running deficits year after year. In 2024, the US government's total fiscal revenue was $4.9 trillion, while its total expenditure reached $6.8 trillion, resulting in a fiscal deficit of $1.9 trillion. On a daily basis, the deficit increased by about $5 billion. In 2023, the US government's fiscal expenditure was $1.66 trillion. In 2022, it was $1.38 trillion. In 2021, $2.77 trillion. In 2020, $3.13 trillion. And in 2019, $0.98 trillion. The expenditures in 2020 and 2021 were particularly high due to the COVID-19 pandemic in those 2 years. Governments around the world had substantial spending during that period, and it was a challenging time for everyone. President Biden managed to hold on by borrowing heavily. During Biden's 4-year term, the US GDP soared by 24%. Such a growth rate, in theory, should have made him one of the greatest presidents in American history. However, the public didn't give him much credit. This is because during those 4 years, the prices of eggs, milk, and bread increased by 50%, rent went up by 30%, and the price of oil rose by 35%. The increase in the cost of living for Americans far exceeded the growth rate of the GDP, with the government consistently spending more than it earns each year. Where does the shortfall come from? The only way for the US government to cover the deficit is by issuing US Treasury bonds, which is what we mentioned at the beginning, the US national debt that has now reached a staggering $37.3 trillion. US Treasury bonds are not borrowed for free, interest has to be paid every year. In 2024, the interest on US Treasury bonds was $1.1 trillion. In 2023, it was $1.02 trillion. In 2022, $830 billion. In 2021, $612 billion. And in 2020, $330. When I wrote about the history of US Treasury bonds in 2019, the total amount of US national debt was $22.2 trillion, and the interest was $500 billion. 6 years have passed, and the US government has pushed the total national debt to $37.3 trillion, and the interest is projected to reach $1.3 trillion in 2025. At the current interest rate, every morning when one wakes up, assuming a situation related to managing the debt, here we use a figurative reference to the person in charge has to be prepared to pay $3.2 billion in interest to the creditors. No matter who is in charge of the country, this situation is bound to cause great anxiety. The US government is simply too extravagant in its spending, and it seems unable to stop. Since the end of the Cold War, both the US government and its people have developed the habit of spending lavishly. The government's expenditures have been increasing year by year, and since fiscal spending is related to the interests of countless people, it is extremely difficult to cut or adjust. As a result, the debt keeps piling up, and the US government has reached a state where it can't survive without borrowing money from all over. The COVID-19 pandemic during Biden's tenure and the Russia-Ukraine war have once again increased the US government's fiscal burden. When a certain person, here referring to a relevant figure like Trump, returned to the White House in January 2025 and looked at the government's financial records, the most pressing issue he faced was the government's lack of funds. What's even more serious is that the government is on the verge of being unable to borrow money. In this episode, let's put aside issues such as the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the US-Iran negotiations, and the expulsion of immigrants. These are all secondary aspects of the current US narrative. The main focus of the current US narrative is still about getting money. Having been in business for a lifetime and gone bankrupt 6 times, a certain person, here referring to Trump, is an old expert in reading financial statements. He surely knows that if the government continues to operate like this, the country will be in big trouble, and the US Treasury bonds, the stock market, and the US dollar could collapse at any moment. Rolling up one's sleeves to rescue the country's finances is currently the top priority for the United States. To manage the finances, the old recipe of cutting costs and increasing revenue is still in play. Here, there seems to be some unclear expressions in the original text, but we try to translate as accurately as possible based on the context. Taking the lead, the Doge team stepped forward. They once swore on the front line that they would eliminate 90% of bureaucratic waste by July 2026, cut $1 trillion in expenditures, and reduce the number of 428 federal agencies to 99. However, after only 3 months of fighting in the enemy's camp, Elon Musk was battered and bruised, feeling so disheartened that he even started to consider retiring. In the 2 months before his potential retirement, with strong support from Trump, Elon Musk fought fiercely. He charged recklessly through the camps of the Department of Health and Human Services, the United States Agency for International Development USAID, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, and NASA. He claimed that he would lay off 200,000 civil servants and cut $1 trillion in federal expenditures within his 130-day tenure. It is necessary to explain to everyone that according to the executive order signed by Trump, the Department of Government Efficiency managed by Elon Musk was scheduled to be dissolved on July 4, 2026. And as a special government employee, according to federal law, Elon Musk's service time within a year should not exceed 130 days, so he was supposed to leave at the end of May. That's why we often heard him mention the term 130-day tenure. In fact, by April 8, Elon Musk had faced strong opposition from both the United States and Europe due to his efforts in layoffs and cost-cutting. Coupled with his conflicts with other confidants of Trump, he had already decided to leave. Therefore, after April, there were no major news from the Department of Government Efficiency. Trump spent most of his time playing the tariff game with countries around the world, and he was quite engaged in it. The Department of Government Efficiency, which was responsible for cutting costs, basically couldn't move forward at this point. So, what kind of results did it finally achieve? As of the end of March, the relevant department, or action, here abbreviated as BUGE, had removed more than 30,000 federal employees and allowed 75,000 people to leave through a buyout program. The most significant achievement was the closure of the United States Agency for International Development USAID, reducing the number of employees in this large agency from 9,600 to just over 600. In the intricate web of global finance, the United States finds itself ensnared in a fiscal quagmire of unprecedented proportions. As of April 2025, the nation's federal debt has ballooned to a staggering $37.3 trillion, equivalent to 35% of the world's total GDP. With a population of 350 million, each American citizen's share of this colossal debt exceeds $100,000, a figure that paints a stark picture of the country's economic vulnerability. The root of this debt crisis lies in the chronic budget deficits that have plagued the US government for years. In 2024 alone, the government's revenue stood at $4.9 trillion, while its expenditures soared to $6.8 trillion, resulting in a deficit of $1.9 trillion. This translates to a daily increase in debt of approximately $5 billion. The situation has been deteriorating steadily, with deficits reaching $1.66 trillion in 2023, $1.38 trillion in 2022, and peaking at $3.13 trillion in 2020. Largely due to the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. The interest on this massive debt pile is a burden that grows heavier with each passing year. In 2024, the US government shelled out $1.1 trillion in debt servicing, up from $1.02 trillion in 2023 and a mere $338 billion. At the current interest rates, the government wakes up each morning owing $32 million to its creditors, a figure that would be daunting for any nation, let alone one already teetering on the brink of financial collapse. The futile quest for fiscal reform entered Donald Trump, who returned to the White House in January 2025 vowing to turn the nation's financial fortunes around. His administration's initial strategy centered around 100 days of reform aimed at slashing government spending and eliminating waste. Spearheaded by Elon Musk, the Department of Government Efficiency (UG) set ambitious goals: eliminate 90% of bureaucratic waste, cut $1 trillion in expenditures, and streamline the federal bureaucracy by reducing the number of agencies from 428 to 99. Despite a promising start, the UG's efforts soon ran into a brick wall. By the end of March, the department had managed to lay off 30,000 federal employees and incentivize 75,000 more to leave through buyout programs. It also succeeded in cutting $130 billion in expenditures by freezing a host of controversial projects, including $22 billion earmarked for housing and vehicles for illegal immigrants, $45 million for day scholarships in Myanmar, and $1.9 billion for the Housing Decarbonization Committee. However, these savings paled in comparison to the scale of the problem. In February 2025 alone, federal spending surged to $603 billion, an increase of $40 billion from the previous year, while the monthly expenditure of the United States Agency for International Development (USAID) dropped from $547 million to $226 million. This was offset by significant increases in healthcare $5 billion and Social Security $8 billion spending. In the end, the UG's efforts amounted to just 13% of the original targeted drop in the ocean for a government drowning in debt. The untouchable titans: healthcare and the military-industrial complex. The real obstacle to meaningful fiscal reform lies in the entrenched interests that dominate the US economy. Chief among these are the healthcare and military-industrial complexes, to sectors that have become virtually untouchable due to their political influence and economic clout. The US healthcare system is a prime example of institutionalized inefficiency and greed. Despite spending a mind-boggling $5 trillion annually, half of the global total medical expenditure, the system ranks among the worst in the developed world. In 2024, the average individual health insurance premium was $9,000, while family premiums averaged $26,000. Yet, despite these high costs, 30 million Americans remained uninsured, and those with coverage often faced exorbitant out-of-pocket expenses and denied claims. This crisis can be traced back to the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan deregulated the healthcare industry, allowing public hospitals to pursue profits and paving the way for the rise of private healthcare corporations. Today, the industry is dominated by a powerful coalition of hospitals, doctors, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical firms, all of whom have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The result is a system that prioritizes profit over patient care, with sky-high prices, rampant fraud, and a lack of basic access to essential services. The military-industrial complex presents an equally formidable challenge. With an annual budget of around $1 trillion, the defense industry is a major driver of the US economy, employing millions of people and generating billions in profits for defense contractors. However, this industry also benefits from a vast network of political influence, with defense contractors pouring millions into political campaigns and lobbying efforts to ensure continued government support. The result is a system that incentivizes waste, inefficiency, and unnecessary military spending. From overpriced weapons systems to bloated defense contracts, the military-industrial complex has become a black hole for taxpayer dollars, siphoning off resources that could be better spent on education, healthcare, and other critical needs. The tariff gambit, a desperate bid for survival. Faced with the intractable problem of entrenched interests, the Trump administration has turned to a more controversial strategy: a global tariff war. Launched on April 9, 2025, the initiative aims to generate an additional $2 billion in daily tariff revenue, or $730 billion annually, enough to cover half of the nation's debt interest payments. The logic behind this move is simple but risky. By imposing tariffs on imports, the US government hopes to reduce the trade deficit, protect domestic industries, and generate much-needed revenue. However, this strategy also risks sparking a global trade war, which could lead to higher prices for consumers, reduced economic growth, and increased geopolitical tensions. The initial response to the tariff war has been mixed. While some countries have reluctantly agreed to pay the increased tariffs, others, notably China, have refused to bow to US pressure. China's refusal to comply has led to a standoff between the two nations, with Trump threatening to increase tariffs further and China vowing to retaliate in kind. In the end, the tariff war may prove to be a short-sighted and ultimately self-defeating strategy. While it may provide a temporary boost to government revenue, it also risks damaging the US economy and undermining the nation's standing in the global community. Moreover, it does nothing to address the underlying structural problems that have led to the nation's fiscal crisis in the first place. The road ahead, a nation on the brink, as the United States grapples with its mounting debt and economic challenges, the future looks uncertain. The current administration's efforts to address the fiscal crisis have thus far been insufficient, and the political will to take on the powerful interest groups that dominate the economy appears lacking. Unless significant reforms are implemented, the US risks falling into a downward spiral of debt, inflation, and economic decline. The consequences of such a scenario would be far-reaching, not only for the American people but for the global economy as a whole. In the end, the fate of the United States will depend on its ability to confront the hard truths about its economic situation and take bold action to address them. Whether the nation has the political courage and economic acumen to do so remains to be seen, but the clock is ticking, and the stakes have never been higher.